Welcome back to History Unlocked. I'm Mr MacAulay, and today we're continuing our deep dive into ancient Egypt with one of the most epic origin stories in human history. We're talking about how Egypt went from a bunch of separate kingdoms fighting each other to becoming the world's first unified nation under a god king called the Pharaoh. This isn't just another boring list of rulers and dates. This is the story of how humans first figured out how to run a massive and complex society and created a system of government so successful that it lasted for literally thousands of years. Picture this. It's around 3200 BCE. There's no writing system yet, no massive pyramids, no unified Egypt. Instead, there are dozens of small kingdoms scattered up and down the Nile River, each with their own rulers, their own gods, their own armies. Think Game of Thrones, but more crocodiles, less dragons. These weren't primitive people living in mud huts. These were sophisticated societies with impressive art, complex religious beliefs, advanced technology for their time, but constantly at war with each other, fighting over territory, trade routes, and resources. So how does this chaotic collection of warring kingdoms become one of the most stable civilizations in human history? Well, the answer lies in one of the most important political innovations ever created: the concept of the pharaoh as a living god. Let me set the scene for you. Before unification, Egypt wasn't really Egypt at all. It was divided into what historians call Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And yes, I know this sometimes sounds a little backwards, but remember, Upper Egypt is upstream on the Nile, which is actually in the south. Lower Egypt is downstream, which is actually in the north. But it's about the flow of the river, not its geographical location necessarily. Now, Upper Egypt was a long, narrow strip of land along the Nile River, stretching from modern-day Aswan up to around Memphis. The people here were probably descended from African populations who'd moved into the Nile Valley as the Sahara Desert dried up. They'd developed a culture centered around the falcon god Horus and wore white crowns. Lower Egypt was the Nile Delta region, where the river spreads out into multiple channels before reaching the Mediterranean Sea. This area had stronger connections to the Middle East and Mediterranean cultures. Their patron goddess was the cobra Wadjet, and their rulers wore red crowns. Now, within each of these regions, there were dozens of smaller kingdoms called nomes. And think of them like city-states, each controlling a section of the river and the surrounding farmland. Each nome had its own ruler, its own patron deity, and its own local traditions. These nomes were constantly fighting, and I mean constantly. Archaeological evidence shows massive fortifications, weapon caches, and clear signs of warfare throughout this period. It was like ancient Egypt's version of the Wild West, except instead of cowboys, you had kings with funny hats fighting over irrigation rights. But here's what's fascinating. Despite all this conflict, these early Egyptian kingdoms shared a lot in common. They spoke related languages, had similar religious beliefs, and used the same basic technologies. They were like feuding family members who fight all the time but are still fundamentally part of the same culture. And here we enter our main character, a king whose name might have been Narmer or maybe Menes, or possibly both. Historians are still arguing about this 5,000 years later, so what we do know is that around 3100 BCE, a ruler from Upper Egypt managed to do what no one had done before. He conquered all of Lower Egypt and united the entire Nile Valley under one crown. The evidence for this comes from one of the most important artifacts in Egyptian history, the Narmer palette. This is basically a piece of ancient propaganda carved in stone showing a king wearing the crown of Upper Egypt smashing his enemies, and on the other side, the same king wearing the crown of Lower Egypt, symbolically showing his rule over both regions. But Narmer didn't just conquer Egypt. He invented a completely new way of ruling it. Instead of just being another warlord who happened to win more battles than everyone else, Narmer and his successors created something revolutionary. They declared themselves to be living gods. This wasn't just an ego or power trip, it was brilliant political engineering. Think about the problem Narmer faced. He had just conquered dozens of different kingdoms, each with their own traditions, gods, and local loyalties. How do you get all these different groups to accept you as their legitimate ruler? Well, the answer is you don't just claim to be their king, you claim to be their god. And not just any god, but the earthly incarnation of Horus, the falcon-headed sky god who was already worshipped throughout Egypt. Suddenly rebelling against the pharaoh wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy. This concept of divine kingship was absolutely revolutionary for its time. Before this, rulers were just humans who happened to be really good at fighting or really good at politics, but the pharaoh was different. He was Horus incarnate on earth, the son of Ra, the sun god, the living bridge between the human and the divine worlds. This wasn't just symbolic. Egyptians genuinely believed their pharaoh was a god. When he died, he became fully divine and joined the gods in the afterlife. The new pharaoh would then become the new incarnation of Horus, and the cycle would continue. Think about how powerful this concept was. In other ancient societies, when a king died, there was often chaos as different factions fought over who would rule next. But in Egypt, there was no question. The pharaoh's son didn't just inherit a throne, he inherited divinity itself. The succession was guaranteed by the gods. This divine kingship also solved the problems of ruling such a large, diverse kingdom, because the pharaoh wasn't just the political leader of Egypt, he was the high priest of every temple, the commander of every army, the owner of all the land, and the ultimate judge of all disputes. Everything flowed through him because he was the god's representative on earth. And the early pharaohs, they were masters of political symbolism. They created visual representations of their power that were so effective, they lasted for thousands of years. The double crown was genius. By combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt into one elaborate headdress, the pharaoh was literally wearing the symbol of unified Egypt on his head. Every time someone saw him, they were reminded that he ruled both lands. Then there was the false beard. Yes, pharaohs wore fake beards, even the female pharaohs. This wasn't about looking manly, this beard was a symbol of divine wisdom and connection to the gods. It was like a religious costume that marked the pharaoh as different from ordinary humans. The crook and flail were equally symbolic. The crook represented the pharaoh as the shepherd of his people, guiding and protecting them. The flail, a farming tool used to separate grain from chaff, symbolizing the pharaoh's role in providing abundance and sustaining life. Even the pharaoh's names were designed to reinforce his divine status. Every pharaoh had 5 official names, including his son of Ra name that explicitly connected him to the sun god. But these weren't just labels. They were a magical formula that reinforced the pharaoh's divine nature every time they were spoken or written. So after Narmer unified Egypt, the next few centuries were crucial for establishing how this new unified kingdom would actually work. This period, called the early Dynastic period, roughly 3100 to 2686 BCE, was when the Egyptians figured out how to transform Narmer's military conquest into a stable, lasting political system. The first challenge was administrative. Egypt was huge by ancient standards, over 600 miles from north to south. How do you govern that much territory when the fastest way to send a message is by boat or on foot? The solution was bureaucracy. The early pharaohs created one of the first professional civil services. They appointed governors called nomarchs to rule the various nomes in the pharaoh's name, established a complex system of scribes to keep records, and created specialized officials to handle everything from tax collection to temple management. But this wasn't just practical administration, it was religious administration. Every official served not just the pharaoh as a political leader, but they served the pharaoh as a god. Government became a form of religious duty, which made the whole system much more stable than if it had been purely based on political loyalties. Now let's talk about some of the key figures from those early dynasties, because their stories show us how the pharaonic system evolved and strengthened over time. After Narmer came rulers like Horaha and Jer, who spent their reigns consolidating control and putting down rebellions. These weren't easy times. Unification was just the beginning, not the end, of the struggle to create a unified Egypt. One of the most important early pharaohs was Den. He ruled around 2970 BCE. He was the first pharaoh to use the title King of Upper and Lower Egypt officially, and he's shown in artwork performing the ritual running of the Apis bull, which demonstrated his divine connection to fertility and abundance. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The early dynasties also had to deal with succession crises, regional rebellions, and the challenge of maintaining unity across such a vast territory. Some pharaohs ruled for decades and left behind impressive monuments, others for just a few years that left barely a trace in the historical record. But what is remarkable is how quickly the Egyptians figured out solutions to their problems. By the end of the early dynastic period, they'd created governmental structures that would remain basically unchanged for the next 2,500 years. That's longer than most modern countries have existed. So, what is it actually like to be a pharaoh in these early dynasties? Well, it wasn't all gold and glamour. Being a god king was actually a 24/7 job with enormous responsibilities. The pharaoh's day started before dawn with religious rituals. Remember, he wasn't just a political leader, he was the high priest of every temple in Egypt. So every morning he had to perform ceremonies to ensure that the sun would rise, that the Nile would flood, that the gods would continue to favour Egypt. Then comes the administrative work. The pharaoh had to review reports from governors, make decisions about legal disputes, approve major construction projects, and manage the kingdom's resources. This required him to not just be a religious figure, but an economist, a judge, an engineer, a military strategist, all rolled into one. The pharaoh also had to maintain his divine image constantly. Every public appearance was choreographed to reinforce his godlike status. He couldn't just walk around like a normal person, he had to move in ways that demonstrated his connection to the divine realm. And let's not forget the military responsibilities. The pharaoh was the commander-in-chief of Egypt's armies, and in the early dynasties, he was expected to personally lead his troops into battle. Being a god didn't mean you get to stay at home while other people did all the fighting. But the pharaoh didn't rule alone. The royal family played crucial roles in maintaining the divine kingship system. And understanding their functions helps us to see how sophisticated this early government really was. The pharaoh's wife, the queen, wasn't just a ceremonial figure. She often served as a priestess of important goddesses, particularly Hathor, and played a key role in religious ceremonies. Some queens, like Nefertep from the First Dynasty, were clearly powerful political figures in their own right. The pharaoh's children were groomed from birth to serve the kingdom. Sons were potential heirs who needed to learn statecraft, military leadership, and religious duties. Daughters often became priestesses or were married to important officials to cement political alliances. But here's what's really interesting. The pharaoh's family members weren't just relatives. They were considered semi-divine themselves because of their connection to the god king. This created a whole class of royal relatives who formed the upper tier of Egyptian society and helped to legitimize the pharaoh's rule. One of the most important decisions made by these early pharaohs was where to put their capital. Narmer and his immediate successors established their main residence at Memphis, right at the junction between Upper and Lower Egypt, and this location wasn't chosen randomly. Memphis was perfectly positioned to control both regions of a newly unified kingdom. It was close enough to the delta to maintain control over Lower Egypt, but far enough south to keep connections with Upper Egypt strong. The choice of Memphis also had religious significance. The city became associated with Ptah, the god of craftsmen and creation, and later the Apis bull, a sacred animal that was considered the earthly manifestation of Ptah. By making Memphis their capital, the pharaohs connected themselves to these important religious traditions. The pharaohs also established royal burial grounds at the nearby Saqqara and later at Giza. These weren't just cemeteries, they were sacred landscapes where the divine pharaohs would spend eternity. The location of these burial sites reinforced Memphis's importance as the religious and political center of a unified Egypt. One of the most important developments during the early dynasties was the invention of hieroglyphic writing. Now, this wasn't just about keeping records. It was a crucial tool for maintaining pharaonic power across the unified kingdom. Before writing, the pharaoh's commands could only travel as far as the messenger could carry them, and there was always the risk the message would be changed or misunderstood along the way. With the hieroglyphic writing, the pharaoh's exact words could be carved in stone and sent anywhere in the kingdom. Writing also allowed the pharaohs to create permanent records of their achievements. The hieroglyphic inscriptions on royal monuments weren't just decorative, they were political propaganda designed to reinforce the pharaoh's divine status and remind everyone of his great deeds. Most importantly, writing enabled the Egyptians to develop complex legal and administrative systems. Laws could be written down and applied consistently across the kingdom. Tax records could be kept accurately. Trade agreements could be recorded and enforced. But a bigger problem than writing that was faced by the early dynasties was how to handle succession when a pharaoh died. Now remember, the pharaoh isn't just a political leader, he's a living god. What happens when a god dies? Well, the Egyptians solved this problem through elaborate funeral rituals and succession ceremonies that transformed the dead pharaoh into a fully divine being, while simultaneously transferring his divine power to his successor. When a pharaoh died, his body was mummified in a process that could take 70 days, and during this time, his designated heir would begin preparing to take on the divine kingship. The heir wasn't just inheriting a political position, he was literally becoming a god. The succession ceremony involved the new pharaoh putting on the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, receiving the divine regalia, and performing rituals that connected him to Horus and the other gods. But from that moment on, he wasn't just a prince who had inherited a throne, he was a new incarnation of divinity on earth. The pharaohs very quickly realized that being a god king was really good for their legitimacy. But you still needed actual people to run the day-to-day business of government, and this led to the creation of one of the world's first professional bureaucracies. At the top of the system was the vizier, who served as the pharaoh's chief administrator. The vizier was responsible for implementing the pharaoh's commands throughout the kingdom and reporting back on everything that was happening. Below the vizier were various department heads responsible for specific areas, like the treasurer, who managed the kingdom's finances, and the overseer of works, who supervised construction projects, the chancellor, who handled foreign relations, and many, many others. We don't need to list all of them. But what made this bureaucracy special was that it wasn't just a secular government. It was a religious hierarchy. Every official served not just the pharaoh as political leader, but they served the pharaoh as a god. And this meant that the government service was seen as a sacred duty, not just a job. So by the end of the early dynastic period, the pharaohs had accomplished something truly remarkable. They had taken a collection of warring kingdoms and transformed them into the world's first unified nation state, governed by a stable political system that would last for thousands of years. They had invented the concept of divine kingship, which solved the fundamental problem of political legitimacy in a way that was so effective it inspired rulers around the world for millennia to come. They'd created sophisticated administrative systems, established permanent capital cities, developed writing systems, and built the foundation for all the incredible achievements we associate with ancient Egypt. But perhaps most importantly, they'd figured out how to make people from dozens of different backgrounds and traditions see themselves as part of a single Egyptian identity. The pharaoh wasn't just a ruler of various conquered territories, he was the living symbol of what it meant to be Egyptian. And this system created by Narmer and refined by those early dynasties was so successful, it became the template for kingship throughout the ancient world. The idea that a ruler could be divine, the political power could be legitimized through religious authority, spread from Egypt to other civilizations. It continued to influence political thought for thousands of years. Even today, we see echoes of these ancient Egyptian innovations. The idea that a nation should have a single unified identity under one leader, the concept of ceremony and symbolism in government, the use of monumental architecture to demonstrate political power. All of these trace back to those early pharaohs along the Nile. But what's most impressive about the early dynasties is how they solved problems that still challenge governments today. How do you create unity among diverse populations? How do you establish legitimate authority? How do you build institutions that last beyond an individual leader? Well, the early pharaohs found answer to these questions that worked for 3,000 years, and that's longer than any modern nations existed, longer than any current religion has been practiced, longer than any contemporary political system has survived. The unification of Egypt then and the establishment of the divine kingship under the early pharaohs really set the stage for everything that followed after. The Old Kingdom pharaohs who built the Great Pyramids, the Middle Kingdom rulers who conquered Nubia, the New Kingdom pharaohs who built an empire stretching from Sudan to Syria, all of them were building on foundations laid by Narmer and his successors more than 5,000 years ago. The system they created was so robust that even when Egypt was conquered by foreign powers, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, those conquerors often chose to become pharaohs themselves rather than trying to replace the pharaonic system with something else. The concept was just too powerful and too effective to abandon. So the next time you see a picture of a pharaoh with his elaborate crown and divine regalia, remember you're looking at one of humanity's greatest political innovations. These early pharaohs didn't just conquer territory, they invented a whole new way of organizing human society, and their creation has lasted longer than any other form of government in human history. That's the real legacy of ancient Egypt's unification and their early dynasties. They showed us with the right combination of vision, symbolism, and administrative skill that humans could create political systems that brought stability, prosperity, and unity to millions of people across vast territories and enormous spans of time. That's a lesson that's just as relevant today as it was 5,000 years ago along the banks of the Nile River. Thanks for listening to History Unlocked. I'm Mr MacAulay. Until next time.